Hello, it's a pleasure speaking to you again. I love doing these Portugal Passive House talks. I wish I could be there in person this year instead of doing this by Zoom, but perhaps next year. Since I last spoke with you, I have published a book called Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle. It's my first book, but it's been printed, and I've already been asked if it will be translated into Portuguese, and I'm looking into it. Now, what the book is about is how we have to deal with the carbon crisis that we face, which, of course, this is the famous hockey stick that shows how the carbon has been increasing so radically. And in the Paris Accord in 2015, certain agreements were made to set a carbon budget, a target, and a limit on warming. And at the time in 2015, they talked about how we had to keep the global warming of the average warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But in 2018, they did an addendum and say, no, the problems with 2 degrees are too severe and we have to hold it at 1.5 degrees. And to basically keep under that carbon budget, which when they did this was at 420 gigatons, which is that hard ceiling number to stay under 1.5, we have to start reducing our carbon dramatically. And it's no longer a slope, it's now a cliff. We really have to cut it dramatically and now. When this was done, it was 420. According to this calculator that I use, it's down to 275. So every molecule of carbon that goes into the air goes against this. And a lot of people say that your personal actions don't matter, that it's basically political action that matters. Michael Mann, the climate scientist, actually said that taking personal actions undermines support for the substantive climate policies needed. This is convenient for Exxon, Shell, and BP. BP, you may recall, 15 years ago was talking about carbon footprints as a way of diverting attention from their own actions. People would say British Petroleum invented the term carbon footprint to blame us for what we're doing. In fact, it's not true. It was invented by Dr. William Rees a few years earlier. They co-opted it. Now, other people will say, we don't have responsibility, just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. I had these great things off Twitter that said, 100 companies are responsible, so it's not my air conditioning. 100 companies are responsible, so I can make Bitcoins. 100 companies are responsible, so I can eat cows. Basically, it's an excuse that everyone uses. But if you go back to the report where it came from, you find they're not actually companies, they're entities, they're national groups like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia, and nobody's going to be telling them what to do. We have to stop buying what they're selling. The other thing that they didn't say when they say this, that these companies are responsible, is that 90% of it are scope 3 emissions. That's basically our using their fossil fuels, us buying what they're selling. We buy it, we put it in our cars, we burn it. So are they responsible for the carbon or are we? You know, every building in Canada where I live is heated by gas. Is it the gas company or did I happen to like a cheap way to keep my house warm? As the IPC says, every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. So we have to make difficult choices. Now, I'm not saying that political action and group action doesn't matter. Of course it does. Collective action is critical, but our individual actions matter too. Now, a few years ago, a study came out of Finland that looked at what we have to do to change our lives to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And it assumes that emissions are caused by consumption, not by production of the oil companies. They call them lifestyle emissions based on our choices. This woman activist in London, Rosalind Reedhead, is the way I found out about it. She decided that she would try to live a year with less than 1 ton of carbon. And that's a very tight budget. It's almost impossible. It's like background noise for a North American like me. I had a look at these lifestyle carbon budgets, and I thought that the proposed budget for 2030 was much more reasonable, 2.5 tons. And that's basically per capita, divide the world population into the total carbon emissions that we can have. Now, half of the world already lives under 2.5 tons, and they're living in energy poverty. But you can see that Canadians and Americans way up in the upper right-hand corner are way too high. I tried to look in this graph and I couldn't actually find out where Portugal is, but for many reasons, I think it's probably pretty good. Also, you know, the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions in the world. And that's not, the richest 10% probably includes just about everyone who's here watching this. It's really the developed world. Now, the study was recently updated. This came out a few weeks ago with a bigger group. And they looked at countries, and again, you can see I'm from Canada, right up at the top. They're saying 14.2 tons. The United Kingdom, 8.5. Again, I don't know where Portugal comes in, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's around the 5 point. In the original study, they looked at the main lifestyle elements that cause our footprint. Their nutrition, housing, mobility, the stuff we buy, and leisure and services. So what I did is I did a massive spreadsheet where I basically for a year tracked everything that I did. I divided the 2.5 ton target by the number of days and I got 6.849 kilograms per day. But it's hard. How do you calculate it? For instance, if I buy an air conditioner, the operating emissions are pretty easy to calculate. I know how much energy it uses, but the problem is it's made in China these days. And so those are basically emissions that are right now under the accounting credited against China. But in fact, if I buy the air conditioner, when you're talking consumption instead of production, those emissions from making the air conditioner are not Chinese, they're mine. They should be on my ledger, not theirs, because they are what we call in the building industry as embodied carbon. It's the critical point. Most people in this conference are aware of the importance of embodied carbon, but it's an issue of everything that we do in our lives. I always thought it was a terrible name because it's not embodied in the product, it's in the atmosphere, and it's counting against the carbon budget now. It's not a life cycle emission, it's a now emission, it's upfront. Some have actually credited me with being the first to use the term. I popularized it and it's getting picked up. And you can see now it is even in these tables, the upfront carbon is the product and construction stage in building. The upfront carbon is emitted before a building is operational and can significantly outweigh operational carbon if the building is really efficient. That's why so many people are looking at things like mass timber and moving away from concrete. Upfront carbon isn't in the bylaws, but it isn't in regulations, but people are beginning to talk about it. And if you think upfront carbon is a problem in buildings, well, in everything else, it's far, far worse. If you look at my iPhone 11, it's got 80 kilograms of carbon emissions in its manufacture. When you look in the details, only 13% of it is in the use of the phone. 80 kilograms. You think about how much that weighs. And people just don't understand embodied carbon. I love this one where Hyundai is in their advertising asking, why shouldn't a car have the same emissions as a bike? And someone's written on it, because of the carbon emissions embedded in the material. They understand it. And there's no real declaration anywhere. Like with some building materials, there is now a declare form that lists the embodied carbon, but you don't know what the embodied carbon is of a pickup truck. And when you plan or design and think about upfront emissions, it really changes the way you build, the way you do architecture, the way you build your cities. You would never build useless things like this restaurant and a stick that Foster is proposing for London. Where I live, the politicians all hate streetcars because they get in the way of them driving quickly. So they're spending billions to basically bury streetcars in concrete tunnels, which has 27 times the carbon footprint of surface routes, when they should be just doing this. In Toronto, where I live, and lots of other cities, they're knocking down perfectly good 20-story towers to build 60-story towers. Whereas 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when the zoning wasn't the way it was, you could build these things. You could build little apartment buildings next to single-family houses. Basically, what I've done is took this chart from the World Green Building Council on how to reduce carbon in buildings, and I applied it to my life. You don't buy what you don't need. You use what you have to the best advantage, and you make it last. You optimize material usage and buy the lowest carbon option and avoid waste. Now, I won't go through the food and the diet very much for this audience because we're talking about buildings. I will just note that eating for climate is different than being a vegetarian or being a vegan, because you find it's all about the beef, that fish is far lower, that tomatoes in North America that are grown in hothouses can be worse than fish and cheese, and that cheese is worse than pork. So basically, you have to eat down the greenhouse emissions. And for me, that just meant giving up on red meat and cutting down waste. The amount of wasted food in North America in particular is extraordinarily huge. Also cutting down on portion sizes. Everything's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger because we're not eating in restaurants and people put value on this. So food portions have just grown. And because they've grown in restaurants, they've grown in our houses. This is a comparison of 50 years ago, a typical serving of pasta to today. Now, what we did in our house was we ate basically a traditional Ontario diet, which meant, you didn't eat a lot of good stuff in winter. You didn't have things. You don't have that problem in Portugal. So you didn't have to eat like this or eat all the tomatoes that my wife can. I remember being in Portugal 2 years ago and being so impressed at the wonderful seafood you had, which of course is local and is a very low footprint, and seeing that they were even adding advertising for vegetarian burgers, vegetarian whoppers. I was very impressed with this. So for food, basically, eat less, eat local, eat more fish, and eat less meat. Now, how we live, this is a very Canadian story. This is not going to be your story. Where I live 150 years ago, 120 years ago, it was just north of the city. It was the playground of the rich, and it was all farmland, separated from the city by a very big valley. So there was nothing up at the top of that hill. Then in 1912, they filled it in. And that was all filled in with crap out of coal furnaces and garbage. It's a totally toxic hill. And they put streetcar tracks in. And in about 1910, it looked like this. And it looks like this today. And I live in what was then basically a streetcar suburb. You could take the streetcar, you could get off, and you could walk to your house that would be very close to the streetcar. So in 1890, it looked like this. And by 1920, 25 years later, after the streetcar was in, it looked like this, all built out. And that's my house in the middle. And this was the streetcar in 1928, and this is it today. It's what you call, and what most people are talking about now, is a 15-minute city. That if I want, I can go find a co-working space, I can go to my doctor. And the problem is there, as you see, is that land use and transportation are the same thing. They work together, they define how we live. So when after World War II, when they built the interstate highways in the United States and they opened them all up to cars, it developed instantly into sprawl, into suburbia, where everybody got their house and their car. And in North America, this is still how people think, that this is the future we want, according to Elon Musk. This is still the dream, that you'll have the single big house, but it'll have solar shingles, a Powerwall battery, and 2 Teslas in the garage. It is zero operating emissions, but vast upfront carbon emissions. And of course, it takes vast amounts of land and a lot of money. It doesn't scale. That's why we should be increasing density, perhaps like they do in Vienna, where everybody lives in multifamily housing. We know now how to build with low upfront carbon materials like wood, which is happening a great deal. Where it's cold, we know now to, well, really everywhere, to build with passive house. In Canada, the issue was dealing with cold. Obviously, you don't have that problem to the same degree. We know now that we can minimize heat loss. If we minimize heat loss, then we can heat or cool our homes with very, very small heat pumps that don't take much energy if our houses are done properly. We know how to build simple forms that minimize the amount of materials that go into buildings, like these I saw in Munich. Whereas what's happening in North America with Bjark and Kittel is that they're doing everything that they can to maximize surface area and complexity. It's ridiculous. So in new buildings, we should be using natural materials with low embodied carbon, lots of insulation and high quality windows, basically passive house. We should be reducing demand as much as possible in existing buildings. And we should be building 15-minute cities. Now, how we move, again, is totally related to basically how we live. And in America, where cars have just been getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of the way they're doing the regulation. And I see the same thing is happening in Europe too. Not to this extreme where the cars are so ridiculously huge, you can't see anyone. But again, it was always that American dream. This is 70 years ago. You've got the house, you've got the car, you got the boat, you got the house, you got the car. I don't see a boat. But the fact of the matter is that electric cars are still cars. They still get parked on the sidewalk. They're no different when it comes to congestion from electric cars, autonomous cars, or Uber cars. And they have a ridiculously high embodied carbon. A Tesla Model 3, when you come right down to it, over its life cycle, is not like zero carbon. It's about half as bad as a conventional vehicle. And if you go and buy one of these new Ford electric pickup trucks, it's actually worse than the life cycle emission of a small European car. And when I did this analysis, the CEO of our company called to complain, to say, how can you not be promoting electric cars? But you've got to get across this idea of embodied carbon. If you understand upfront carbon, you know it's a disaster. Now, again, you know this stuff. You've got these things figured out in Portugal. I saw this, and it was lovely. What I've done is I got myself an electric bike. I didn't drive at all for the entire year. I drove my e-bike. Canada's cold. In winter, I had to dress up a little bit to go through. But last winter, this was 2 years ago, last winter, it didn't even get cold enough to do this. We have to redesign our cities to have a place for everyone, not just cars. I noticed in Toronto, where I live, because of the COVID crisis, they actually made it look a lot like Vienna. And you guys have this figured out anyway. I've seen you've got the streetcars, you've got public elevators and public escalators. You know how to deal with this. This is a problem you've beat. The other thing that I found is it's really hard to get in a plane. I mean, this will be my biggest consideration if I'm invited to come next year to Portugal, because this has a huge footprint. When our company got bought last year, I had to go to New York for 30 hours, and it basically, in carbon, took up a month of my carbon's allowance. You're not without the problems here. I mean, this train that I took from Porto to Aveiro 2 years ago cost more than the flight from London to Porto. There's a real imbalance in how we pay for these things and what they cost. That's just not right. So the key thing that I found in mobility is that the biggest single factor is the car. You've got to get rid of it. You've got to choose where you live carefully so that you don't have to drive, and fly as little as possible. The other thing is what we buy, and this was my big problem. This was, people don't normally think about what they buy. I happen to have an Apple fixation and buy just about everything that they have. And when I total it up, it's insane. My iPhone was 80 kilograms. My 27-inch iMac was almost a ton, 824 kilograms. My MacBook Air, 174. My iPad Pro, 113. Even my dinky little watch is 38 kilograms that I can't lift. So it all totaled up to 400 kilograms a year, 16% of my annual budget, the single biggest item after my gas. The other thing also in North America, and I suppose in Europe too, is the amount of waste. It used to be that you got everything delivered in returnable, refillable packages. Coca-Cola and other drinks were in refillable bottles, and they couldn't travel very far because they're heavy. Where I live in Ontario, there were 5 breweries just for one brand. Now there are 1. It's all because of this guy, Bill Coors, who invented the 2-piece aluminum can. And with the American interstate highways, you could centralize production of beer all in one giant brewery in Colorado. McDonald's realized that when everybody was in their cars, they no longer had to pay for restaurant space, for tables, for chairs, for waiters. You know, they could outsource all of that to us. And they had to train us. Nobody understood about garbage. There weren't very many waste baskets. Everybody just threw it everywhere. So the packaging companies trained us to throw things away and to recycle. They've convinced people around the world that recycling is the most virtuous thing that you can do in your lives. All the toys from kids from the earliest age, recycling. So much the American Institute of Architects did a study and found that when you ask Americans what lets you lead a longer and healthier life, and the very first thing is recycling. Whereas we know that it's a fraud. We know that almost none of it actually is recycled. What is recycled is downcycled, and only 2% of the plastic waste that we put into the marketplace is actually being still used, recycled. And they say they're going to have a circular economy and they're going to take the plastics back. But we know it's a farce because nobody's recycling properly now. It all has to be picked up. Only 14% is getting picked up, so nothing changes. Their business is turning fossil fuels into petrochemicals and then into single-use plastics and then into garbage so that we buy more fossil fuels. But people are lazy. Even when they're in a restaurant and there's waste baskets everywhere, that's how it ends up. In my year, I tried to avoid ever buying single-use plastics or drink out of a can. And, you know, if you want a coffee, you go and sit down and you enjoy your coffee. So really, the whole thing is sufficiency. How much do you really need? For any consumer good, the best strategy is to buy high quality with timeless design, maintain it well, and use it for as long as they can. I won't spend any time on the sort of leisure activity other than to mention that I used to love driving 2.5 hours north of Toronto to get in a snowboard, to get electrically winched up a hill, and then slide down artificial snow made with electricity and water from the lake. I had to give that up. So I bought cross-country skis and I strapped them to my e-bike and I went to the neighboring park. And you know, I had a lot of fun. It took less time and saved money, and I got better exercise. In the end, in my whole study, I really found, and this is what applies again, what you learn from buildings applies in life, that embodied carbon, the upfront carbon emissions from making stuff, is more important than the operational emissions, and becoming more so every day. My electronics use nothing to run, but the carbon emitted while making them has buried me. And the same is true for our homes, our cars, and our buildings, and everything made from metal or silicon or carbon. Transportation matters. And basically, you know, the world that I see that we really should be living in is like this picture of Stockholm in 1928, where everybody is like either in bicycles or on streetcars. So I updated that IPCC ad. Besides every action matters, and every year matters, and every choice matters, really we have to note all the time that upfront carbon matters. Thank you very much.